As far as when to think about your multiplayer strategy, I think it needs to be really, really early. We'd all love it for it to be this like flip the switch and now it's multiplayer. It's just not that way. And there's a lot of things you have to think about going into multiplayer and focus your strategy around what kind of multiplayer game do I want? Where's the focus going to need to be for the players so that then you can decide technology-wise what's the right things to use.
It's way more technically complex than building single-player games. So the best way is to integrate it properly into the design process. Even if you start with a single-player version of the game, because it's simpler to make a lot of design choices so that you can play either with or against other people directly from the start.
The biggest challenges for a multiplayer game is that it's not twice as hard, it's probably 4 to 5 times as hard. There's a lot of intricacies that happen in the code for a multiplayer game, and just even in the design as well. You have to just kind of understand what's going on there from a much broader perspective than you do when you're playing single player.
There are so many challenges into building multiplayer game. If you just create like a virtual world and you put avatars, it's very easy. You can put thousands of avatars, it doesn't matter, they can pass through each other and there is no interaction. But as soon as you add like gameplay rules, it becomes much more complex. It's actually known as an n-square problem, and that restricts very fast your ability to have more than 30, 40, 60 players, because the amount of computation that's needed and the amount of bandwidth that's needed to receive the position and other information of all those players at the same time increase drastically.
In multiplayer, you have a whole batch of new costs to consider, like the hosting costs for the servers, the data transfer costs, you have costs for on-call service, and also you have costs for non-paying customers.
The difficulty in matchmaking, you kind of want to make sure that people have an enjoyable time playing as a beginner, but also playing as an expert. So with a smaller player base, it becomes more difficult to match beginners with beginners and more experienced players with experienced players themselves.
Multiplayer games are definitely growing in popularity. I don't see that damaging single-player games, to be honest. Those are always gonna be there, and you still have the ability to create compelling experiences for players that just want to play alone.
Multiplayer games is all the rave. A lot of people love to talk about multiplayer, but single players also really has a place, obviously. Most games that you download, you kind of want to start in a single player mode where you can learn to know the game.
There's a lot of single player experiences that still make a lot of sense. There's lots of other games where it's very narratively driven, and narrative driven games are much, much harder to pull off in multiplayer because who's the one driving the story, right? And so I think there are still plenty of opportunities for single player games in VR.
The most significant innovation that I'm seeing in the multiplayer space is the birth of games as platforms.
I'm really excited about the multiplayer VR space because of the hand tracking. I'd also love to see technology coming more and more into the mainstream of things like face tracking and stuff, because one of the things that we've noticed in our testing is once the player goes from having hands that are really just controlled by controllers to now having the full dexterity of your hands, when you're sitting in VR and having a conversation with someone and you're gesturing, you're pointing, and you're doing all sorts of, all of that emotion really comes across. I think it's just gonna be incredible for making the multiplayer experiences really be something that is much closer to the real in-person interactions, which our human brains are kind of wired up for that.
Something that we're really excited about at Niantic when it comes to multiplayer games is how do we actually get people to connect in the real world? So how do we actually start persisting experiences at particular locations, but really trying to get people to meet in the real world through these multiplayer experiences?